The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the event that we've been building up to for the last several weeks. I may have said this before, but I think it bears saying again. It is hard to, I think, put into perspective how big of a deal the American Civil War really was. Um, it it really is, other than maybe the Second World War, it is the event in American history. We've only been around for a little over 200 years. Basically, the first 100 years, we were building up to this war. In the second century, we've been still trying to recover from this war in many ways. Um, and I think, you know, you can tell this just by how we deal with the war. We don't even all agree what the war was about. Historians don't have any disagreement, but you start getting into the regular public, as you know from class, in your first assignment in my class, you ask people, what is the Civil War about? And you'll get a bunch of different answers. Hell, people can't even agree on what to call the war. What we really call it is the American Civil War, but some people call it the war between the states. Some people call it the war of northern aggression. Um, we're still not done with this war yet. And some of we're still regionally divided. Look at any presidential election. The South tends to vote very differently from the North. We still have racial divisions. Um, yeah, this is a big one. But even going back just to the 19th century, this is the bloodiest war America has ever been involved in. If you take every other war that we were involved in, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the wars against Native Americans, the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, the First Gulf War, the War on Terror. You put all those wars together, and still more Americans died in this war than all those other wars. Because, of course, everyone who died in the American Civil War was an American. The world couldn't believe it. There had been other civil wars, for instance, the English Civil War in the 1600s, which we numbered in the hundreds. This one, over 600,000 Americans died. And that's just soldiers. That's not, and that's people who died in the battlefield. That doesn't even include, a collateral damage. And it also doesn't include slavery. And again, this is, before we even get to the war, we've talked about it already, but you have this bloody, violent legacy of slavery leading up to this war. So, again, this is going to leave our history, our land, blood-soaked. And let's get into it. So, as I think we got into at the end of the last lecture, the build-up to the Civil War, we have this incredibly divisive election, without a doubt the most important election we've ever had, because literally the fate of the nation depended on the outcome of this election. And again, we voted along regional lines. The Republican Party, a brand new party, 1854, just created. They win the overall election. They win the vote, the popular vote and the electoral vote. They sweep the North, the West. There are some other parties, of course. The Democratic Party has split in two. So the main Democratic Party, Stephen Douglas, only got one state, the state of Missouri. Wasn't even Douglas's home state. There was also this little party, the Constitutional Union Party. These were people that were pro-slavery, but they did not want to break away. They actually got 3 states. They actually got more than the Democrats at this point. But of course, the Southern Democratic Party was the party that swept the South. But the South, even with the 3/5 compromise, the South, did not have enough citizens. Now, of course, if they didn't have slaves, and they could have won this election, but then again, if they didn't have slaves, they would have probably voted for Lincoln. Anyway, Abraham Lincoln is the president at this point, or at least he's been elected president. Obviously, the election still has to get ratified by the U.S. Congress, and then at that point, of course, he officially becomes the U.S. president. And real quick, just to kind of break it down, it's very interesting to look at, how we actually voted at the really local level. And again, you can see you can almost see the Mason-Dixon line just at looking at the returns of the voting. But I thought, since we're in Southwest Georgia, I thought we might go down a little bit further. You can see by county. Of course, the counties were a little bit different at this point. Some of the counties, like Grady County, didn't exist yet. But nonetheless, as you can see, it was overwhelmingly the green, and the darker green it is, the more solidly Southern Democrat it was. And of course, the candidate was the current vice president at that time, John C. Breckinridge. By the way, Lincoln didn't have a chance in the South. He was not even on the ballot for most Southern states. He wasn't even an option for Southern states. Anyhow, so the moment Abraham Lincoln is elected, a candidate from Illinois who was opposed to slavery, ever since he was a child, his family were opposed to slavery. Born in Kentucky, his family moves out of Kentucky into nearby Illinois because they were very anti-slavery. But even though he stood against slavery, he was very clear, and he meant it at the time. He was not going to get rid of slavery as president. In fact, he even said, I don't have the right to do this. Now, I know everyone listening is going, wait a minute, I thought Lincoln is the great emancipator. Now, once the war begins, the Constitution does give presidents war powers. It doesn't tell you what those are, but he will take the war powers clause in the Constitution and eventually will start to free the slaves. But that's not until we get into the war. But there is no indication that he had any designs to free the slaves. But the assumption in the South was that he would free the slaves. And of course, South Carolina very quickly says, we're going to break away. We're going to secede. If Congress does indeed ratify the vote, and we see no reason why they won't, once they do that, we're going to break away. This is a crisis moment. The United States is literally falling apart. Abraham Lincoln, even though he's not president, he won't be president until March 4th of 1861. Because nowadays it's January, but this is back when it still went all the way to March. He starts writing letters and sending telegrams to the governors and the congressmen and the senators from the South saying, please, please, please don't leave. I am not going to get rid of slavery. At the same time, Stephen Douglas, who was his opponent, who was the Democratic candidate that completely lost this election, he gets on a train and he starts to meet with governors, like in Virginia, again, imploring them not to do this. But the president at that moment, President James Buchanan, the Democrat, who his party didn't even nominate to run again. I mean, that's how bad he was considered. I mean, that his own party were like, we're not wanting this guy around. The guy who is often considered one of the worst presidents of all time. This is the moment he gets that reputation. Because what does James Buchanan do? We know this country is falling apart. Andrew Jackson had said back in 1833, the last time that states talked about seceding, South Carolina almost broke away in 1833. Andrew Jackson said states are not allowed to leave. If they leave, that will mean war. So everybody knows when South Carolina said we're going to break away, everybody knows what that meant. That meant we're going to go to war. I mean, South Carolina knew it. By seceding, they haven't done it yet, but by even threatening to secede, they are declaring war on the United States. It is that serious. What does Buchanan do? Nothing. Not a thing. In fact, he is very clear. There is nothing I can do to stop them. All he wants is for the war to wait, because he knows it's coming. He just wants it to wait till he's not president anymore. That's it. It gets worse with him. But of course, in December, the U.S. Congress does indeed ratify the vote. So the election is official. Abraham Lincoln is president. A guy named Hannibal Hamlin. I know you're going, who? is the vice president. It has been ratified. That's it. In South Carolina, December 20th, they hold their legislature holds a meeting and they vote, yes, we are going to secede. After the new year, we see Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all agree to the same thing. Now, there are some states missing there, if you notice. That is not all the southern states. In fact, usually when we do this in class, it's always fun to see if students can name all the other southern states. There's a lot of states missing. North Carolina, Virginia, the oldest state. I mean, the very first English colony, also the first place to have slavery. So North Carolina's not there, Virginia's not there, Maryland's not there, Tennessee is not there, Arkansas is not there, Missouri, I don't know if I just said it, sorry if I did, Kentucky's not there. In fact, I feel like I'm missing one. And then the one that everybody forgets about, Delaware. People forget they only had about 400 to 500 slaves at this point, but officially Delaware was still a slave state. So that's a whole lot of states that haven't yet seceded. So this is only partial. But other than South Carolina, they're really not that old of states. I mean, Georgia goes back to 1733, but Florida and Texas, I mean, that's 1745. Some of these other states are even later than that. Mississippi and Louisiana, Alabama, I mean, they were Indian territory all the way up until the 1830s. So they're not that old of states. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were so quick to break away. Because, to some degree, they don't have this long heritage of being states. Virginia and North Carolina and Maryland and Delaware, they're very different in that regard. By the way, this is when Buchanan makes a speech, and he says, states are not supposed to break away, but I can't stop you from doing it. That would be like me saying to you, I have $20,000 in my wallet. You're not allowed to take it, but I'm going to set my wallet on this table, and I'm going to leave the room, and if you do take it, I can't stop you, and I won't stop you, and I won't call the cops on you. So please don't take my money. You're probably going to take my money because I pretty much just told you to basically take it. So how do states argue this? And I know a lot of you are doing an assignment now where you're working on this as your paper. But the basic argument that they made is that these southern states said that this is exactly like the American Revolution, that government is supposed to protect our property. We don't think Abraham Lincoln will protect our property because he's going to free those slaves. And, we are talking, a couple of billion of dollars, invested in these slaves. So they are like, you're not going to protect our property. Therefore, going back to John Locke, the English political scientist from the 1600s, he made this argument that Thomas Jefferson used in the Declaration. They say we have the right to declare ourselves independent. And also the other argument that goes along with this is that they're arguing the United States is not truly a nation, but really a confederacy, a loose group of states that are already independent, and kind of like joining a country club. At some point you can just not pay your dues and drop out. And that's what they're saying. We can drop out anytime we want. So January comes along. Now, basically these southern states have seceded. They have basically declared war. Now, again, if I take something from one of you and I take it, like I grab your cell phone and take it, if you don't try to get it back, then it's my cell phone. You basically are, by not doing anything, you're giving it to me. You're not calling the cops. You're not trying to take it from me. You're not beating me up. So that's what the southern states are doing. They're seceding. They know constitutionally they're not supposed to do this. I mean, they all agree to this. As far as, they all get it, but they have done it anyway. And they're waiting for the United States to come and bring them back. Just like if I took your phone, you'd get your phone back. Either you do it or you call the cops to do it, right? So the ball is now in Buchanan's court. They have declared war. And that's something else people sometimes disagree, even nowadays. Like, oh, well, the North started it. Like, no, the South started it, you know. But it's in the ball is in Buchanan's court now. He is president. He's commander in chief. He is supposed to execute the law. What does he do? Again, nothing. One of the big problems is that throughout the South, there are forts, federal forts, that have U.S. soldiers, that have been built to protect the United States from invasion, right? So you have forts in places like, Savannah and St. Simon's Island, Key West, Florida, Pensacola, Florida, Mobile, Alabama, and of course, Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So all the southern states are like, well, we are not part of the U.S. anymore. So those U.S. military forts, those now belong to us. So give them over. And of course, there's soldiers stationed at these forts. And for instance, at Fort Sumter, the South Carolina militia has surrounded the fort. Fort Sumter is a little island off the coast of South Carolina, just a little ways out from Charleston, South Carolina. So, there are militias surrounding them in the water. They have cannons trained on them from Charleston. And South Carolina is basically going, we want that fort. Now, everybody's a little worried about pulling the trigger. It's like everyone's kind of waiting for the other one to blink. No one really wants to go to war, but they're all ready. And so Buchanan realizes he's got to do something because these soldiers are running out of food. They're running out of medicine. And he's got to, he doesn't want to just let them go. So he needs to reinforce them. But he knows that by doing that might spark a war. So he sends a message out. He says, I'm going to send a ship to Fort Sumter, a U.S. Navy ship, with food and supplies, but no guns, no ammo. And I'm going to, replenish the fort. Please don't fire on us. And he actually told the ship privately. He said, if you get fired on, just turn around and leave. So anyway, the ship starts to go to Fort Sumter. This is in January. Immediately, South Carolina fires on a U.S. Navy ship. And the U.S. Navy ship immediately turns around and goes away, under orders by Buchanan. Think about that for a moment. A U.S. state, some people, which are, I'm going to say something that might make a couple of you mad. We are talking about traitors here. I mean, as far as the United States is concerned, this is an act of treason, right? So traitors have fired on a U.S. Navy ship. They have fired on the American flag. And the U.S. president runs away by sending, because he had told the ship to run away. That's how much Buchanan doesn't want to do anything. And whether, however you might feel about the start of the war, this is not what a president's supposed to do. This is why he is considered the worst president of all time. And because we know how bad this war is going to be. And he probably could never have stopped it, but he doesn't even try. In fact, he's going out of his way to not do anything. This is why he is so reviled by historians and political scientists. Anyway, we finally get Abraham Lincoln as president. He's finally inaugurated on March 4th. As some of you may know, there were some attempts on his life. There were some threats. So he came into D.C. under disguise. He grew a beard. This is when Abraham Lincoln gets the beard. And he kind of snuck in. He got picked on for that later when people found out, like, oh, what a coward. He just snuck in. But it makes sense. But anyway, he finally gets to D.C. He's inaugurated. He meets with his cabinet. He meets with his generals. And he says, guys, what am I going to do about Fort Sumter and some of these other forts? And the advice he's given is quite surprising. Most of the people say, Fort Sumter, who cares? There's hardly anybody there. Why matter? Does it really matter whether or not we keep it or not? I mean, there's only 73 men there. Lincoln couldn't believe that was the advice he was given. Because from his perspective, he thinks, well, if I give in a little bit, I might as well just give in it all. If I say, oh, you can have this fort, then basically I'm giving in to their demands. I'm giving in to these traitors. It's kind of like going to a terrorist and going, okay, you can kill 2 Americans, but you can't kill 5. You're like, no, no Americans get killed. And that's his argument here. And so he does what a president's supposed to do. He takes advice, but then makes his own decision. And he chooses to lead. And he decided, no, we are indeed going to try to keep these forts. We probably can't keep them, but we're going to try. So on April 12th at 4:30 a.m., now he did do it early in the morning, he sent a ship in to give these guys some food and some medical supplies. I mean, these guys were really, really in trouble at this point. General Beauregard was in the militia group, watching all of this. A guy named Robert Anderson was the commanding officer of the fort. At that point, when the ship showed up, the fort began to be shot at, and Beauregard orders, let's go, let's start shooting at this fort. At that point, this is actually the flag. It had 33 stars on it at the moment. Kansas later will, of course, be added to the Union. But what's interesting is that the American flag always kept all the stars. They never took out the southern states, because by doing that, they would be admitting that the southern states indeed left the Union. And of course, from a United States viewpoint, they never left. They tried to leave, but they hadn't actually left. But the fort itself eventually fell about noon that day. There's always been some argument of a guy named Abner Doubleday, who was at the fort. Some people argue that he fired the first shot. Abner Doubleday is credited with inventing baseball. Poor Abner, we don't think he actually fired the first shot. And by the way, he didn't really invent baseball. He did help write the rules for it, but actually baseball goes back to England all the way. But anyway, the fort fell by noon. And in fact, most of the men at Fort Sumter, many of them immigrants, by the way, a lot of them German and Irish immigrants. But anyway, a lot of them ended up immediately joining the Confederacy. Many of them were Southerners who wanted to join the Confederacy. Very quickly after that, several other forts fell, like Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. So there was a whole, like a slew of forts that all fell around the same time. At that point, Abraham Lincoln, I mean, now it's for real. There has been shots fired on both sides. By the way, South Carolina did fire first, but it is a true war now. This is like Concord and Lexington back in the American Revolution. It is a real war now. So at that point, Abraham Lincoln says, okay, we got to get ready for a war. So he begins to call up troops. And what I mean by that is, again, if you might remember, the American military was always really, really tiny back then. And so, it wasn't ready for war. It was just a bare minimum. So at that point, he's like, hey, guys, we got to get ready for real war. So he starts, basically asking for volunteers, and eventually they'll start drafting people. At that moment, that's when several other states in the South decides to break away. So North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas join with the rest of the southern states. But again, as you can see on this map, the gray is the slave states. The pink line is the divide between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. But you can see there's some gray above that line. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, all of those, what they sometimes refer to as the border states, they choose not to break away. And Virginia, which was, at one time much larger, the western half of Virginia breaks away. And in 1863, officially becomes its own state, a free state. Because again, this is something I want to come back to. Not everybody in the South supported this. That's a major point. I do want you to know that all white Southerners were not on board with this. Many, many non-slave owners did not want to do this, especially those living in the mountain regions like Western Virginia. These guys were never going to be slave owners. They had no desire to be slave owners. They wanted to be Americans. So even the slave South wasn't completely set on this. By the way, some people think that pink line you see, a lot of people say, oh, that's the Mason-Dixon line. And that's not actually true. the Mason-Dixon line actually goes back a bit further. Um, it actually the Mason-Dixon line refers to a line by Jeremiah Dixon, and it goes back to 1820, and it has to do with the divide between Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. It's not completely right. And some people argue that, of course, the Mason, but nowadays when we say Mason-Dixon line, we just mean the North and South, right? And a lot of people think that this is where we get the term Dixie from. And there's a lot of debate about this. Why do we call the South Dixie? There is, it probably does come from the Mason-Dixon line, but why don't we call it Dixon instead of Dixie? There is the DIX, which was in Louisiana, that was like the $10 bill was referred to as that. There was a guy named Dixy, Dixie, who was supposed to be a kind slave owner, but in New York, you know. So, like many of the words we use, there's a lot of confusion. And then, of course, there's the song Dixie. Look away, Dixieland, right? What's really interesting is that song was written in 1859, before the Civil War. By the way, Abraham Lincoln loved that song. It was a big hit song throughout the United States. It was actually written by someone in Ohio, and that person in Ohio was an African American who wrote that song. So it's really weird that, what most people think of as, the song Dixie is of Northern origin and of African American origin. But of course, it became very popular during the Civil War. And anyway, okay. So before we really get into the war, and this goes when you talk about any war, is, why are people fighting and who has the advantage? It's just like talking about sports, which team has the advantage? And of course, nowadays we know who wins. We know the United States is going to win. We're still a united country today. So as a historian, I'm interested in why do we have that outcome? What did the U.S. have? And I'll say North and South, but I don't really like saying that because it's really not the North and South. It's really the Southeast versus everybody else. It's not just the North. I mean, you're talking about the Midwest and the Southwest and the Northwest. I mean, it is the entire country versus the Southeast. It's really the USA versus the CSA. So what advantages did the USA have? Well, first off, again, why are people fighting? And most of the Americans fighting are fighting to preserve the Union. Notice what I don't have there, to get rid of slavery. There are plenty of Americans that are fighting for that, including African Americans. There are a lot of people that truly, want to free people. But the vast majority of the U.S. Army, I mean, remember, a lot of them were slave owners from Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri, and Kentucky. They're trying to keep the Union together. To them, that's the most important thing, that this is about the nation, keeping that together. Slavery is just an added element. It becomes more about slavery as we get into this, but that's not exactly why the USA is fighting. Now, what's interesting is, of course, the CSA, the South, is fighting in large part to keep slavery. There's some other things too, we'll get into it. But to a large part, they're fighting to keep slavery. So it's interesting, and I think this is why even today there's some confusion. They're on two sides of the issue, right? But the reason they're on two sides is not directly opposed to each other. I'm going to talk about a controversial topic for 2 seconds. To me, it's kind of like the issue of abortion. On one side, you have pro-choice that say, a woman should decide for herself whether or not to go continue with the pregnancy and whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, that is her choice, it's her body. But a person who's pro-choice doesn't necessarily go, let's kill babies. That's not their argument. Their argument is whatever you end up doing, it is up to the woman. And then, of course, on the other side, pro-life are arguing, this is a human life that you're killing. We want to preserve that life. But that doesn't mean that somebody who's pro-life is anti-woman. But yet that's sometimes how that argument is perceived. So it's sort of like they're on two opposite sides of the fence, but kind of at different positions along that fence. And that's very similar to me to the Civil War. Again, it's not that the USA, that everybody was opposed to slavery. What they were opposed to was breaking up the Union. However, more of the CSA was for slavery. And and when they talk about we're fighting for states' rights, that's the state right they're fighting for. So again, they're on opposite sides, but not directly opposed. And like I said, I think even today, when people are arguing about the Civil War memory, I think that's why sometimes there's some disagreement. Because people say it wasn't about slavery. Hell, half the people in the U.S. Army weren't fighting. It's like, yeah, you're right, but then again, the U.S. Army wouldn't be fighting if the South wasn't fighting for slavery. Anyway, okay, enough of that. So what advantages does the USA have? So again, there's a pretty strong reason to fight to preserve the Union. Obviously, manpower. It's 3-1. We're talking a huge chunk of the country is in the USA. Of course, they have an organized army. They're ready to go. They have an established military. And there's a 3-1 advantage over the Confederate States. That's huge right off the bat. Plus, most of the food grown in the country was grown in the North and the Midwest and far West. Even though there's tons of agriculture in the South, I mean, South was an agrarian part of the country. Most of what they were growing was cotton and tobacco, some rice, some, but not much. The South was growing just enough food to eat. In fact, they were buying much of their food from other parts of the country. And so, places like, Illinois, Ohio, they're growing corn and wheat, potatoes. You can feed an army on that. You can't feed an army on cotton. So that's a huge issue, advantage for the USA and a major problem for the CSA. Industry. Again, because the South as a region sort of chose to focus on growing cotton because there's a lot of money in that. So they basically chose not to industrialize. While the Northeast and the Midwest, they were building railroads and factories. And many of these factories could be easily converted to turn into making guns and textile mills to make clothing and such. So they can supply the army with ammunition and uniforms and medical supplies. The South is not going to be able to do that. There's places like Macon and Mobile and Montgomery, even Bainbridge, where there were some factories, but not that many. They were importing most of this stuff. That's a huge problem. And of course, transportation. All this railroad up north, all these telegraphs and ability to communicate very quickly. Not so much in the South. The South was pretty wide open as far as, not very developed. That's a huge problem for the South and a major advantage. By the way, I'm going to have a short clip. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, there's a wonderful scene. It's not a very accurate film. I love the movie. Maybe I should be careful saying that because but I will also say it is completely not history. And it actually is incredibly insulting, I think, to African Americans in the way it portrays slavery. Yet I can't help it. I love old movies and I do love that film. I just know it's completely inaccurate. But there is one bit in it that is accurate. And that is at the very beginning of the film, the character played by Clark Gable, a guy named Rhett Butler, he hears all these guys talking about war and he's like, "You fools, let me tell you why you're not going to win." And he basically says everything I just said. And it's the one scene in the movie that's completely accurate. Anyway, so the Confederate States. And by the way, you're going, huh? What's up with that flag? We'll talk about flags in just a moment. Anyway, so what's the advantages? And we know they're going to lose. And I just went through a bunch of stuff that's going to hurt them. But they have a lot of advantages too. First off, why are they fighting? And a lot of what I have there is about slavery. I know you're all going, hey, he didn't put slavery there. But this is about slavery to a large degree. Fear. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of what the world will be like if slaves are freed. Remember, most Southerners, white Southerners, were not slave owners, but they have been raised their entire lives in a slave society. And they've been told by politicians, they've been told in church, they've been told by their parents that African Americans cannot live amongst us unless they are controlled through slavery, that they are violent, that they are savage, they're barbarians. There is genuine fear by many small farmers of like, oh my God, what's going to happen if we free these people? It's also about power. This is about economic power and political power. And how do they get that power? The owning of slaves. But once the war gets going, even if you were against the war, once the U.S. Army comes in and starts fighting, now you feel under attack, and you might fight to protect your home, because believe me, when the U.S. Army came, guess where they got their food from? A lot of it came from farms and such, and they would, say, look, we're going to take over your farmhouse. We got to house our troops today. So a lot of people would fight back, protecting their home. These are some pretty, personal reasons. They're fighting a defensive war. That's important. Again, if I take your phone and kind of like the South breaking away, right? So I take your phone. I don't have to beat you up. All I got to do is just run really, really fast and just make it to the point that you don't want to fight me. And this is actually something that we see throughout history. Small powers winning wars by simply, the United States did this in the American Revolution. George Washington didn't have the army to beat the British. But what he could do is run away, attack, run away, attack, run away, make it so difficult, make it so cumbersome that Britain didn't want to stay in the war. We will see this in American history later. Wars like the Vietnam War. We don't get defeated in the Vietnam War, but we did walk away from it because we decided it wasn't worth it. We've sort of done that in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we're still, it's 2020. We're still in both of those countries today, because it's actually really hard to fight small enemies sometimes. And that's what the Confederacy is like. We don't have to beat the United States. All we got to do is keep the war going long enough that the United States will run away. And by the way, both sides used to think when this war began, they all thought it'd be barely a year. Neither side thought that the other one would fight more than about a year. Nobody guessed how long this war was going to be. They have morale. They really do. I mean, they're the ones starting it. They think many Southern leaders and many other, regular people thought we're right. We're going to break away. The United States is either going to just let us go, or they're going to go, okay, yeah, we were wrong. Keep slaves. We don't care. They really think they're right, and they think they're going to win. And that is huge. That confidence is massive. They're on their home turf. They know the land. They know where stuff is. And one of the advantages for the USA is also an advantage for the CSA. In other words, the South does not have a lot of railroads and developed roads and bridges at this point. In a way, that's a disadvantage for the South, but it's also an advantage for them because it means the Confederate Army can't use those railroads and roads and bridges, but it also means that the U.S. Army can't use them either. And you do forget how big the South actually is. It's a massive territory. I mean, just thinking of Florida, one time I drove from Pensacola to Miami. I could not believe how long of a drive that was. And, not too long ago, I went to a conference up in Augusta. I drove from Quincy, Florida, just below Bainbridge. Oh my God, that was an all-day drive. You really do forget how big the South is. So that was a huge problem for the North that benefited the Confederacy. And finally, I talked about confidence. This idea of perceived advantages. That clip from Gone with the Wind that will be online. You hear these guys going, oh, we're going to whip those Yankees. We're going to win. We're so great, And, this ridiculous overconfidence. But at the same time, that was an advantage at first. If you're playing sports, I'm the last one to talk about that. But if you're playing sports, you don't walk up to the plate going, I'm going to strike out. Well, guess what? You're going to strike out. You as your coach will tell you, envision making that touchdown. Imagine making that basket. You're going to hit a home run, right? Most of you are too young to remember the boxer Mike Tyson. Today he's like a comedian that does cartoons, but back in the early 90s, Mike Tyson was literally scary. And Mike Tyson, when at the boxing match, when the bell at the beginning of a ring went off, he would literally just run across the ring to the other side. And the people on the other side, sometimes, I remember watching a match. I mean, the boxing matches lasted like 20 seconds. They were that quick. And I remember one time the guy was climbing the ropes, panicking, because again, the confidence of Mike Tyson, and plus he was also amazing, he was, but the Confederacy was like the first couple of battles, like the Battle of Bull Run, the very first major battle. When the battle began, the Confederates literally started screaming and running across the battlefield as fast as they could, which was not what normally happens. And many in the U.S. Army literally just ran away. They could not, they've never seen anything like it. And so, again, the South thought they were tougher. They thought they were better. Now, again, I'm a Southerner. I love the idea that Southerners are tougher than everybody else. And, like Hank Williams Jr. saying, country boys can't survive. And the argument's always been, I think people still think this. We're all a bunch of country boys and we know how to hunt and fish and we know how to use a gun and we're tough. Not like those sissy city kids up north. Well, first off, most of the quote unquote North back then were not cities. Most of them were farm kids as well, right? Not only that, but back then or today, this idea that city kids are wimpy, yeah, go to South Central LA, go to the Bronx, hell, go to Glasgow, Scotland, where I take students and talk about how tough you are and see how long you last. The reality was, skill-wise, both sides were about the same because they're the same people. They're all Americans. But there was a moment where the Confederacy thought they were better, and that made a difference for the first year or two. Then it's going to be a problem, but we'll talk about that later. By the way, that is the original Confederate flag. The problem with that flag is it looks a lot like the American flag. And so during the heat of battle, when the smoke and, maybe you get injured, you got to go back to your line and you don't know where you are and you're looking for your flag and you see a flag that's red, white, and blue and some stars and you run to it and, oh crap, I'm on the other side. And now I'm either shot and killed or I'm taken prisoner. So very quickly, the Confederacy realized that that flag is not going to work. So they switched. So on the left, this was the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. That was kind of like the main army. I'm not a military historian. I don't want to get too deep into that. But both Confederacy and the U.S. Army was actually comprised of a bunch of smaller armies and divisions and all of that. And a lot of them would have their own flags. For the Confederacy, the most important of these armies was the Army of Northern Virginia, run by a guy named Robert E. Lee. Their job was to protect Richmond and try to take D.C. So most of the major battles you've heard of is that army. Well, that was their battle flag, the St. Andrew's Cross with the stars of the Confederacy. So the Confederate government decided to adopt that as their official flag. So the actual flag of the Confederacy is what you see on the right. So not to get too picky, but most people fly the left. When they fly the Confederate flag, they're usually flying the thing on the left. That's technically not the Confederate flag. That's a flag specifically of the Army. But anyway. But what's interesting is in the South, we do see elements of this flag throughout the South to this day. That St. Andrew's Cross. Now, to be fair, Spain also had a very similar flag, so that might be why Florida has that. But again, some states are very clearly evoking on purpose the Confederate flag. So, for instance, at the top, those are the various flags of Georgia, going back to at least 1920. So you can see the very first flag going back to not the first one, but the earlier flag already looks a little bit like the first Confederate flag. Then in 1956, it was changed to the flag you see there, which incorporated that Army of Northern Virginia emblem. That's not an accident that it was 1956. That was right after Brown versus Board of Education. So it was in part a reaction against integration. And in fact, the governor who signed that into law was Governor Marvin Griffin, who was from Bainbridge and ran the newspaper in Bainbridge. The 1950s is when the Confederate flag actually became very controversial. It used to be just considered a historic flag from the past, but this is when it kind of gets incorporated as being sort of an anti-civil rights flag, which is, And then around 2001, there was a lot of pressure to let's get rid of that. And so they came up with this weird flag that looks like a museum exhibit. Nobody liked it. In fact, the Governor Barnes of Georgia got voted out partly because of this issue. So in 2003, they came up with the flag that is still the Georgia flag today. And everyone's like, yay, Georgia doesn't have the Confederate flag anymore. Yeah, it is the Confederate flag. It's the original Confederate flag. Even has all the stars for the Confederacy. It's even funny that even pro-Confederate people today are like, I ain't flying that flag. That's not the Confederate. It's like, oh, yes, it is actually. Anyway, so really nobody should be happy with that. And then of course Mississippi doesn't give a damn. They just put two Confederate flags together into one big flag. And in fact, not too long ago they had an election of whether or not to get rid of the Confederate flag. Nope, they're not getting rid of it. Anyway, who cares about flags, really? So, the Confederate States of America, now that they, were really at war, they have to create a government. So, before Fort Sumter, when it was only 7 states, originally the capital was going to be in Mobile, Alabama. It's because Mobile, I just made that up. I'm sorry. Montgomery, Alabama was originally the going to be the capital of the Confederacy. But of course, once Virginia joins, I lived as a little kid in Virginia. I love Virginia, but Virginia is pretty arrogant. And so, of course, they were like, no, we are going to be the capital. It would actually make more sense for it to be Alabama because it's further away, but nonetheless. So the capital moves to Richmond, Virginia. And, of course, they're having to create a constitution. They're having to create a government itself. So the Confederate Constitution is almost exactly like the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is really good. They just changed a few things. They specifically throughout it talk about how they're going to protect slavery, explicitly, but they also keep emphasizing that states are independent and this is a voluntary union, which is a problem. I mean, this is a real problem because, part of the problem in the United States is, according to the South, is they don't like what's going on. They can just walk away. Well, if you can just do that, then you're not really a country. And in fact, during the war, we're going to see this issue come up. It is interesting. This is the printed version of it. And this is just the preamble of it. So it's somewhat similar. We, the people of the Confederate States, but it says each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent federal government, establish judgment. So they're emphasizing the independence. But it is interesting, if you might remember from the Constitution lecture, there's a lot of debate of whether God should be in the Constitution. They made sure God was in it. They did specifically put God in there. That was another little thing they changed. They also, of course, once they have a constitution, they have to hold elections. They're going to have a Congress, and they're going to have a Supreme Court. They're also going to have a presidency. Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi, became the president, and senator from Georgia, Alexander Stephens, who will go on to later be a senator again and also be governor of Georgia. He will be vice president. They actually were very different, by the way. Politically, they were completely different. In fact, Alexander Stephens, towards the end of the war, is actually going to actually try to negotiate peace. And if you've ever seen the movie Lincoln, which is really good, the guy playing Alexander Stephens literally looks exactly like him. It's amazing. Jefferson Davis was elected for a 6-year term. He never ran for re-election because the Confederacy didn't even last 6 years. So he's going to be the only president they had. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that not everybody in the South was the same. By the way, when I keep saying the South, I really mean the white South. I'm not talking about the enslaved African Americans. They're not going to have much of a voice in this. But for the rest of the South, they're not the same. And this is something to keep in mind. And this is going to come up as a bigger issue as we go along. There are 3 factions in the South. There's nationalists. Those are people such as Jefferson Davis who want to create a true nation. Then you have states' rights people. Governor Brown of Georgia or Governor John Milton of Florida are going to be examples of this. There are people that argue, yeah, the nation's fine, that's great, we're Confederacy, but what's really important is what the states want. And again, it's a core contradiction. So if there's going to be a debate over something, the states are like, well, we can just leave. And so it's really the same problem I mean, this is a kind of an ongoing debate up until this point. If there's an issue, if there's a disagreement, who has more power, the states or the federal government? And that's one of the reasons the states break away over the issue of slavery, because they're like, well, we want to decide whether we have slaves or not. We don't want you deciding. That issue has not been resolved. It's still a problem. And in fact, Georgia is going to threaten to secede a couple of years into this war, because Jefferson Davis is going to demand more troops, and Governor Brown is going to say, no, we've given you enough troops, and if you can't make us, and if you do make us, we're going to walk away. So this is a real problem. In other words, had the Confederacy won, they probably would have broken up within a couple of years anyway. But then there's this third group, Unionists, and the guy you see pictured here is a guy named Johnson, Andrew Johnson, who later will be the U.S. vice president. When Lincoln gets reelected in 1864, he dumps Hamlin, and he has Johnson join him. Johnson was a slave owner from Tennessee. He was a senator in the U.S. Congress, and when the states seceded, he was like, I'm not seceding. I believe in the Union, and he stayed in Congress. He was a senator without a state. But a lot of people in the South voted to stay in the Union. In fact, if you look at this map, this is from an old textbook, you see different voting blocks, and the darker spots, those are where the majority of the people in those counties actually voted not to secede. And then, you have a lot of areas that are kind of divided. Now, where we are in Southwest Georgia, because it was dominated by the slave owners, voted for secession. But you get into northern Georgia, the mountainous regions, or even down in Florida, where there's not much agriculture going on. But you can definitely see West Virginia. Yeah, they didn't vote for secession. And those are going to be the Unionist peoples. And those Unionists are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the war. And it's one of the reasons the South eventually surrenders. And again, I flipped the slide a little too quick there. That's one of the reasons why, I mean, that's something that I think people forget about, is there was a lot of diversity in the South as far as what they wanted. As far as where was this war fought, it really was kind of two theaters. Almost two distinctly different wars. The first theater is what they call the East, but really it's this area here. And this is the area where most of the battles you've heard of. This is the area of the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee. It's basically between the capitals, Richmond, and then just 90 miles away, Washington, D.C. And so each side is trying to take the other side's capital. And so you get battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, and the Battle of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the first Bull Run. All of these are right here. So it's a relatively small area. What they call the Western Theater is really the rest of the South. Georgia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And they're all important. But the reality is, this is where the war was won or lost. While Robert E. Lee and later Ulysses S. Grant are constantly exchanging shots up in Virginia, this is where the war is won and lost. It's everywhere else. And we'll get into that in just a moment. So how do you know when you win? And this is an important issue that sometimes I think people don't talk enough about, even today. If you're a leader of a country and you're about to go to war, you better have a clear goal. And it is surprising when you look back how many times even our country has gone into war. Vietnam War would be a good example. I think Iraq may be a good example, where we don't know when we've won. Like, what does winning actually look like? We know why we're going into it, but how do we know when we're done? And it's amazing how easy that is for people to do that, to go into something and not know how to get out of it. In this war, there were clear goals. So the USA has the main goals because, again, it's like you have to get your phone back from me, right? So to win the war, the USA has to defeat the Confederacy. They have to. So they have to take Richmond, the capital, and they need to take the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is the lifeline, it is the spine of the South. So those are two major things they have to take, and that dictates a lot of what happens in this war. They have to destroy the Confederate Army in both theaters, right? Or unless the Confederate Army just ultimately surrenders. So they're going out of their way to do whatever they can to stop it, you know. And they also, again, the best way to fight a war is to get the other guy to not fight. And you do that by changing his opinion, right? Or her opinion. So in this case, it would be the public opinion. They're not going to do a very good job at this, but they're going to keep, you know, Lincoln's going to keep saying, hey guys, you know, if you just quit, things will be okay. The Confederacy has a little bit easier of a goal. Again, they don't have to defeat the U.S. Army. All they have to do is run them off. Make it so hard they don't want to fight anymore. Of course, they have to defend Richmond, and I don't have it here, but also defend the Mississippi River. And again, the same thing, tried to break down the morale, break down the public opinion of the rest of the country. So the rest of this lecture is going to be just kind of running through the main events. Now, if you're really into military history and you're really into Civil War, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff I'm not even going to mention. Of course, then again, you probably already know all about it. What we're going to do is look at what are those events that specifically led to the outcome that we see. And number one on this is going to be the Anaconda Plan. So this is what the Anaconda Plan looked like. When Abraham Lincoln met with his cabinet, he basically, you know, and his generals, he basically said, okay, we're at war. How do I win this war? Come up with a plan. And Winfield Scott, who, by the way, was a Southerner from Virginia, but who remained loyal to the United States, he said he came up with a plan. And an anaconda, of course, is a big snake. And he basically said, this is how you win. And so he said, you know, we know what our advantages are and we know what the South's advantages are. What we're going to do is we're going to take all their ports, all, you know, any ability for them to leave or bring supplies in, we're going to cut them off. So we're going to, you know, and again, if you look at what the U.S. Army does, they methodically go after all the coastal cities and all the coastal places like Key West and Jacksonville, Savannah and Charleston, right? And we're also going to cut off their ability to communicate. We're going to cut off their ability to bring food in, to bring supplies in. And like a snake, we're going to surround them and then we're going to squeeze until they can't breathe and they can't eat, and either they die or they surrender. And by the way, this is modern warfare. This is how wars are fought. Amateurs talk about bravery and how cool guns you have. You can always tell somebody when they're talking about war, you know, or when they make a movie, it's always about one guy with a big gun and he saves everybody. That's not how wars are won. That makes for good movies. Professionals talk about logistics because all soldiers are brave. All soldiers can fight. But it's logistics. Can an army feed itself? Can an army talk to each other? Can they get from here to there? Do they have enough bullets for their gun? If you can't do those basic things, you're not going to win. And so not only do you have to do those things, it's also imperative to get the other side to be able not to do that. This is how wars are fought today. Now, at the time, this was not a popular plan. A lot of people around Lincoln were like, that's a dumb plan. But this is actually how they won the war. In fact, if I didn't have enough time, I could just say, that's it, we're done. Because this is how the war is won. Again, the first couple of years, it looks like the USA is losing because all their victories are these minor little victories. But after 3 or 4 years, it began to work. And that's, you know, and so this is how they win. And for 1861, that's really it. The Confederacy are going to win almost every battle for the first 2.5 years. And then they're going to start losing. So again, that confidence I mentioned just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because it is, they just like, there's no way we're going to lose this war. Oh my gosh, we're winning every major battle, but not really paying attention to what the U.S. Army was actually doing, which was again slowly surrounding them and then cutting them off. In 1862, the big event, there were two. The first big event was the United States captured the city of New Orleans down in Louisiana. And if you don't know your geography, I guess it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Remember, one of the main goals: control the Mississippi River. So already with this victory, and it's not even a major battle, but with the capturing of Louisiana, they already control much of the Mississippi. I mean, nobody's going in or out of that mouth. Now, the South can use the rest of the Mississippi River, but in other words, England's not going to be able to bring resources in. And keep in mind, the South is not going to win unless they get outside help. Just like the United States, that's how we won the Revolution, by getting help from Spain and France. The Confederacy is hoping to get supplies from France and England. They're not going to, but they're hoping to. This cuts off a lot of that. So it was a major victory, and people did recognize it at the time. But now, looking back, we realize that this was a huge moment, much bigger than they even realized. The other big event of 1862, and again, there's several battles, but the other big one is the Battle of Antietam, which was actually a major loss for the Confederacy. So again, if you remember, the goal of the Confederacy, and by the way, Robert E. Lee, I keep mentioning him. I'll show you a picture of him a little later in the lecture. He was not the only general, of course, of the Confederacy, but he is kind of the one that really came up with the war plans. I mean, he was really the brains behind the Confederacy as far as military went. And of course, he was in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia to really, I mean, he was kind of the front line of defense for the Confederacy. There's a lot of myths about Robert E. Lee. I've heard many times that, Robert E. Lee, didn't even believe in slavery, wasn't a slave owner, he didn't fight for slavery, which is completely untrue. The Lees of Virginia, I mean, his grandfather helped declare independence, right? He grew up on the slave farm, plantation, not just a farm, Stafford Hall. The only reason he didn't own slaves initially was because he was in the military and he was moving around all the time. But he actually ended up marrying a woman who father-in-law owned what was known as Arlington Plantation, just outside of D.C. And when he died, Robert E. Lee inherited that plantation. It had over 200 slaves. Now, in his father-in-law's will, he wrote in there that whoever inherits my farm has to release the slaves within a couple of years. And that was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee did not free the slaves. Finally, in December of 1862, after this battle, in fact, he was forced by his in-laws to obey the will. And so he reluctantly, with court order, released the slaves. So anyway, Robert E. Lee absolutely was pro-slavery, but he also was a brilliant general, without a doubt. He is one of the main reasons why the Confederacy lasts as long as it does. Unfortunately for Robert E. Lee, he does make a major mistake here. His goal, his plan, which was a good one, was to fight a defensive war. Don't go on the offensive. Make them come to us. He screws up here. He decides to go against his own plan. He moves up from Virginia into Maryland. And his plan is two things. One is to hopefully bring Maryland into the war. Maryland just barely chose not to secede. By one vote, Maryland did not secede. So he knows that if he goes into Maryland, they might join Virginia. For him, that would be great, because that means D.C. would be surrounded by Confederate states. Then he's hoping that maybe he could even attack D.C. from the rear. This ends up being a major defeat. It's also the bloodiest single day in American history. It was an embarrassing defeat for the Confederacy. And they have to retreat. And that, I'm going to come back to that, but it is amazing that they retreat and the U.S. Army doesn't stop them. Remember that. Anyway, Antietam, Maryland. This is the first war that we have photographs for. at least the first American war. Not during the war because the cameras couldn't capture action that fast. They just weren't able to, it would all be blur. But you do begin to see the images of the aftermath of this war. So what is the significance of Antietam as a battle? If I had to pick one battle, this would be it. As far as the most important. Most people pick Gettysburg, and that is important, but this is the big one. First off, England and France probably were never going to help the Confederacy. They had people here, diplomats here. They were, both England and France were hoping to eventually get North America back. There was always that goal. But England, then again, were making a lot of money by trading with us. They didn't really have a need to take us over. But the biggest reason that they were never going to help out is that both France and England, by this point, had outlawed slavery completely. In fact, it's kind of like people who say used to drink and then they quit drinking. Sometimes they become really adamant to try to get everybody else to quit drinking. England was very anti-slavery. They used to attack slave ships, sink them, or rescue the people because they were so anti-slavery. And so that was, they were probably never ever going to support the Confederacy in any major way because of the issue of slavery. But there was still always a little bit of hope. Well, any hope that they would help the Confederacy ended with this battle because they realized there was no way the South was going to win. It just, the writing was on the wall. So it is, because of that, it is the turning point of the war. This is the moment really where the Confederacy loses this war, even though the war is going to go on for 3 more years. The other thing is, by summer of 1862, partly because of England and France, Abraham Lincoln realized that this may be the reason to go ahead and end slavery. And maybe it's time to, as a war president, using his war powers abilities in the Constitution, to issue a proclamation to end slavery, to emancipate the slaves. So we get what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation. But it is interesting. This is the actual draft of it, the original draft. It is interesting. It doesn't do everything that I think people think it does. It freed slaves only in the rebelling states, not everywhere else. So again, if you look at a map of the Southeast, the areas in blue here are areas that were not included in this. The New Orleans area and again Tennessee, because by that point the U.S. Army controlled Tennessee and Maryland and Delaware and Western Virginia and Kentucky and Missouri. Because Lincoln did not want those states to run away. If he tried to end slavery in those areas, they would probably have joined the Confederacy. So this is only about the rebelling states. So not Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, or any other state that might join the Union as a slave state in the future. And many people in the U.S. Army were furious at this. I mean, some of them were slave owners themselves. They were not happy about this. Although many other Americans were thrilled at this. And of course, African Americans were thrilled, and so were England and France. But why did he do this other than to show to England and France that we were committed, at least to some degree, to end slavery of the country? Now, by the way, again, Lincoln said, I have this power to do this through the war powers, in the Constitution. But he didn't know would this stick past the war, which is why we eventually will get the 13th Amendment, which Lincoln wrote and got passed through Congress. It didn't pass till spring of 1865, which officially ended slavery everywhere. But that's not going to be, again, till the end of the war. But there was an incentive embedded in this. A lot of people don't realize. Notice it was issued in 1862 in September. It didn't become effective until January 1st, 1863. Now, the reason there is this long period is because in this proclamation, he makes an offer to the South that if a state, say Georgia, decided to quit fighting and rejoin the Union, they could keep their slaves. Again, what Lincoln's goal in the war was to end the war and keep the Union together, however he could do this. And so he's willing to free the slaves to do this, but he was also willing to keep slaves if it meant keeping the Union together. It doesn't work, of course. And so January 1st, 1863, slaves are freed in some areas, but again, not other areas. So any area that U.S. Army controls, slaves will be freed, but not everywhere else. But one thing this does bring up, which was a huge debate, should there be African Americans in the Army? Now, the South is never going to have, you will see people saying that online. There's this ongoing urban myth that slaves fought for the Confederacy. It is true that slaves were used to help feed the Confederacy and, and to do jobs for them. Of course, they were slaves, but they were never given guns in the South. Because if you're a slave, you got a gun in your hand, you're not a slave anymore. You're going to shoot your master and run away. But we do see eventually slaves in U.S. uniform, but not till after this. Because even, again, keep in mind, the United States, unfortunately, was a racist country. So many white Americans, including in the North, would have been uncomfortable with that image you see there, an African American with a gun in their hand. But by 1863, this war is not over with, and we need everybody fighting. And there were a lot of African Americans that were more than willing to fight. To fight for the country, but also to free their families. And also, this was an incentive for slaves to run away and run to the U.S. Army. And in fact, a lot of them will. 250,000 will end up joining the U.S. Army. So here we are, it's 1863. This war has gone on for over 2 years now, longer than anybody ever thought it would. And there is a lot of tensions on the home front on both places. USA and Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation is it was a lot of tension all over the place. Draft, nobody likes drafts. Drafts, of course, with the government makes you join. So we see draft protest and riots on both sides. The biggest was actually in New York, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'm going to show you an image from it. This whole idea of substitutions and exemptions. This was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, which unfortunately is so often the case. So if you had money and you were drafted, you could just pay somebody to fight for you, about $200, in fact. Or you could be exempted if you owned a big plantation or you owned a factory. Oh, well, you don't have to fight because you're contributing to the war in other ways. So again, ultimately, it turns out to be all these poor people fighting. And remember why this war was being fought to begin with, to preserve slavery, which just the smallest percentage of Southerners owned slaves, the richest of the rich owned slaves, and yet all these poor farmers were being sent to war to fight for these guys. And that class aspect of the war, once you get to 1863 and 1864 and the drafts are kicking in, suddenly this is starting to become an issue, a huge issue. Now, in the South specifically, the Anaconda Plan is beginning to work now. There are food shortages. Prices are through the roof. This is when that whole conflict between states' rights, people like Governor Brown of Georgia, versus the nationalists like Jefferson Davis, this is when that's really starting to come to a head. Because, there's a lot of tensions and again, Georgia's threatening to secede. And there's an income tax. The very first income tax anywhere in the United States was actually in the Confederacy. The federal income tax, in fact, I'm recording this the day before federal income tax are due, April 15th. That doesn't come about till 1913. The Confederacy did the very first income tax. And the Confederacy, just like today, nobody wanted to pay more taxes. People were furious at that. And then in the North, again, the United States, I'm breaking my own rules, aren't I? In the United States, it's the issue of Emancipation Proclamation and the presence of African American troops. So I mentioned there was a major riot in New York City, draft riot. This is a newspaper image, a drawing of it. And notice what's happening here. You have a lot of white New Yorkers, I just made up a word, lynching an African American, burning him, hanging him. They did this to hundreds of African Americans because the way they looked at it was, it's your fault that we have to fight this war. It's your people that we have to now free. So if we have to die, you have to die. I mean, so in other words, a lot of racial tensions. And again, this was a racist country at this point. You may know that politics today, Republicans are portrayed as an elephant and Democrats are portrayed as a donkey. That actually comes about a little bit after the war. But the very first time that basically we see a Republican portrayed as an elephant is here. Just to see the elephant meant to go to war. And so it says the man who won the elephant at the raffle. Basically, oh, so the United States is going to win, and guess what you guys get? A bunch of free African Americans. So again, you can see these racial tensions outside of the South, which kind of hints at the racial problems that this country is going to have after the Civil War. And by the way, this was the very first political cartoon by a guy named Thomas Nast that first specifically showed not only Republicans as an elephant, but Democrats as a donkey. And it's actually from this that we get those two political images. But this was about 9 years after the Civil War. All right, so now we're in 1863, and there's two major events that year. First off was the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. This was the second time that Lee broke away from his plan. But this time it was a bit more desperate. He had several reasons why he was doing this. First off, he wanted to, Ulysses S. Grant was in the West. He was the main one of the big generals of the U.S. Army. He's in the West. He's doing a lot of damage in the West. In fact, he's about to take the Mississippi River. He's hoping that by going into Pennsylvania, that might draw Ulysses S. Grant out of the West. He's also, threatening northern cities. Part of the argument that the South was, if those northern cities actually had to fight a war, they would surrender in a heartbeat. So he's going into Pennsylvania, maybe with the idea of going after Philadelphia, then maybe Baltimore, Maryland, right? But really, and by doing that, hoping that maybe the U.S. will just go, well, we can't win, we're going to walk away. That was very far-fetched. The real reason he was doing this, first off, he was trying to get supplies. They were running out of supplies by this point. He is raiding farms. He is raiding warehouses, looking for anything. But the biggest reason he's doing this is because in Virginia, there's an area known as the Shenandoah Valley. And this is where most of the agriculture for food for the South, this is the breadbasket of the South. And that's where the U.S. Army was. And by going into Pennsylvania, he is hoping to draw the U.S. Army out of Virginia into Pennsylvania to follow him, which they do, so that he could preserve the food for the South. So again, this is actually quite desperate. The confidence is beginning to go away. And now they're doing whatever it takes to just kind of stay alive, if you will. So the battle itself happened just outside of a little town called Gettysburg. Gettysburg itself, not important. It's just where the two armies happened to meet. And it was a 3-day battle. The first day was really just more of a skirmish. They kind of literally just kind of ran into each other. They shot a few shots. That was about it. And in fact, a guy named James Longstreet, who was the second in command under Lee, said, "Lee, we got to get out of here. The U.S. Army outnumbers us. They have already occupied the high ground. They're going to demolish us if we continue to fight." And this is where Lee's arrogance, unfortunately, played a role for him. He basically said, "We're not going to run away. They're here. We're here. We're going to fight." And boy, that sounds tough. And it was a stupid thing to say, because on July 2nd and then on July 3rd, they absolutely got demolished. In fact, it was almost an unbelievable loss. 50,000 total casualties, a third of his army gone in just 3 days. And of course, they retreat back to Virginia, and nobody stops them, believe it or not. But of course, the bigger significance of this battle is what happened a few months later. This was an awful battle. I mean, just the numbers were staggering. And later in that fall of 1863, they were going to develop, start burying the dead and dedicate a national battlefield there, a cemetery there at the battlefield. And so they decided to have a big ceremony for this. And so they invited a lot of speakers to come. A guy named Everett Edwards was going to be the main speaker at this commemoration. And I guarantee nobody in this room probably has heard of the guy. He was a major speaker at the time. He ended up speaking for 3 hours. I defy you to tell me what he said, right? But of course, at the last moment, they decided, I guess we should invite the President of the United States for this thing. Lincoln was not very popular in the U.S. at this point. So he was invited at the last moment, and he gave a speech that lasted barely 2 minutes. Hardly anybody actually heard it. But over the years, this has become one of the most important speeches in American history. Before I get to the speech, though, believe it or not, we think this is the only photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg. And I know you're going, where? And there's some debate. The arrow is pointing at what most people think is the only picture of Lincoln. And here's a close-up of it. But then again, you go, well, that may be him. Maybe it's not him. He has to be in there somewhere. We know he was there, and this is where all the speakers were. A couple of people think that the guy in the center there could be him. I think that's even less likely. And then this is the third candidate. This one I can almost see. You know, of course, everybody's got a top hat back then. More than likely, the first image was Abraham Lincoln. But this can be the only image of him. He's got to be somewhere in this photograph, and that first one is probably him. Anyway, this is the actual handwritten version of it that he gave. He wrote this on the train ride to Gettysburg. So very quickly, used to be students had to memorize this speech back in the old days. It's not talked about much anymore, but it really does change the entire sort of image of the war, and over time even changed the image of the United States. I'm going to read you some of it. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's taking Jefferson's phrase from the Declaration. He says, this is what we fought for. What's really interesting is that really wasn't officially what the American Revolution was about. I mean, yes, Jefferson said that, but as we've talked about already, the founding fathers were like, we don't really believe that. You know, that wasn't really what we're fighting for. But for regular Americans, that was what they were fighting for. So Lincoln has taken that idea and saying, this is what we're fighting for. This is what makes us America. Then he goes on. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation can long endure. We met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who lost their lives here. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, especially Edward Everett. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work for which those who fought here have thus so nobly advanced. You know, in other words, we have a big task in front of us. We have to do something. They died here. They cannot die in vain. We have to keep fighting for them. And so what are we fighting for? We're fighting for the idea that this nation, under God, by the way, that phrase, under God, this is where that phrase comes from, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So again, what he's doing is he's taking the Declaration, which had kind of been forgotten about by this point. The Declaration, the Constitution was supposed to kind of replace the Declaration. And he's saying, no, they're one and the same. The Declaration was this wonderful idea, all men are created equal. And then our government, a government of the people, our government, a government that we vote for and we serve in, that's what the government is there to do, is to ensure that all people are equal. And that's what we're fighting for, because we're fighting to end slavery and show that this is for real. So again, he's changing a lot about the war with this speech. Again, at the time, it wasn't, hardly anybody actually heard it, but it was published in newspapers and later in publications. And over the years, this has really become the image of the U.S. So he's saying that this war is about equality. It's about freedom. It's about ending slavery. It's about keeping this noble experiment, that this country is not like other countries. It's based on principles that other countries don't have. And we can't let it in. So if one of you go to another country and somebody says, "What's America about?" You're probably going to say something about it's about freedom and equality and liberty. You're not really talking George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. You know what you're talking about? You're using Lincoln's language. That's why this speech is so important. And it really does change the nature of the war and of the United States. I'll give you another example. Before the Civil War, a lot of times people talk about the United States in plural. These United States. But after the Civil War, including after this speech, it becomes singular. The United States, one nation, not a whole collection of little tiny nations. It is one nation. That's the other thing this speech does. All right, so that's Gettysburg. The other big event of 1863 was Vicksburg, the Battle of the Bergs. They happened almost at the same time. So this is when the guy Ulysses S. Grant comes into play, which everybody, in the media loves his name. U.S. Grant, United States Grant, Uncle Sam Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Everybody loved that name. And there's always all these rumors about Ulysses S. Grant. He was a big drunk and he was a It is true that when he first joined the military as a young man, he was married. He joined the military. He missed his wife. He was, I think, stationed in Oregon, and he drank too much and he got kicked out. He went back home to Illinois, was very poor for a while, in fact. He actually bought a slave, I think in Kentucky, eventually freed the guy. So he technically was a slave owner briefly. But he was selling firewood at one point. That's how poor he was. But when the war began, because he was trained at West Point and he was a good military person, when the war began, he re-enlisted, was immediately made an officer, and worked his way up, and was really the one U.S. Army general who was actually winning battles in a major way. And he's about to really make his name. So Vicksburg, this is a city in Mississippi that basically controls the Mississippi River militarily. If you're going to take the Mississippi River, you have to take Vicksburg. And look at what that river does. That border of Mississippi, that is the Mississippi River. It does almost a 180 at Vicksburg. This is actually my photograph of a map at the battlefield, the national park at Vicksburg. Look at what that river does. Again, they have changed it a little bit. They have actually diverted it over the years. But look at what the river originally did. It was literally a true 180. And where it says "you are here," that is actually where the battle took place. So this is standing where that map is. And you can see how high I am at this photograph. I'm looking down on the Mississippi River. So it's a spot high up, a bluff. And they had about 300 cannons on this bluff. So any boat coming from the south or from the north to take Vicksburg are going to get blown out of the water. It was the Gibraltar of the South. It was a place you could not take. And again, you can see why Vicksburg is so important, because the blue is what the U.S. Army controls. So they control all of the north. They got Tennessee, and they also got New Orleans. But in the middle, they don't have Vicksburg. They can't control the Mississippi River. So what Grant did is he went deep into the interior and came up to Vicksburg from behind, which they weren't expecting. That was very dangerous. And he ended up on July 4th, Vicksburg fell. And which, by the way, the city of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July again until World War II. But at this point, the United States just achieved one of its major goals. They now control the entire Mississippi River. This cut the Confederacy in half. 30,000 Confederates have to surrender. Over 100 cannon are taken. That's plus the 50,000 casualties. That's 80,000 people in 2 days. And again, this is the other major turning point. This 1-2 punch of Gettysburg and Vicksburg a year after Antietam. And this is really it. And Lincoln realizes, because he's had a lot of problems with his generals, this is the guy. This guy is going to win the war for him. So in 1864, when the war cranks back, because the war would kind of go into submission every winter. They didn't fight in the winter. So when the war kicks back up in the spring of 1864, Grant is now the general in charge of the war on the U.S. side. So before this moment, Lincoln had plenty of generals. What I'm talking about is a general in chief, the guy in charge of military policy. Winfield Scott, he came out with the Anaconda Plan. Nice guy, was very good on paper, but wasn't a good fighter. Same with McClellan, same with Halleck. These are guys that, again, were good at planning. But one of the aspects of war is you have to fight. You have to take risk. Lee may have made some major mistakes with Gettysburg and Antietam, but what made Lee a great general was that he took risk. You have to fight to win a war. At some point, you can't just plan. These guys were timid. Again, Lee won Antietam, and then they let him escape. It's like punch. It's like you're going to be in a fight, and you punch somebody once, and then you don't. Then you just stand there. I'm not going to fight anymore. You might knock the guy on his butt, but he's going to get back up and clobber you. If you're going to win a war, you got to fight and 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 fight until the guy is bleeding dead or he surrenders. These guys didn't fight like that. And therefore, what that really means is war go on and on and on and on, and people are just dying and dying and dying for no reason. Grant wasn't like that. Grant fought. If he lost a battle, he just got right back up and fought the next day. If he lost that battle, he got. When Lincoln recognized this is the guy, and he put him in charge, Lee said, when he heard, we just lost a war. Lee knew he was in trouble when Grant was chosen. And of course, people around Lincoln said, this guy's a drunk, which wasn't true by this point. But Lincoln said, I don't care. Give him a case of whiskey. This guy wins the war. And in fact, there was a moment where Grant lost, the first time he took in charge, because basically he was sent to Virginia to oppose Lee. And so the first battle he fought with Lee, he lost. And so the soldiers were getting ready to leave. They were packing up their bags. And he said, he gave a speech. He said, where are you guys going? He said, well, we're going home. We always go home after a battle. He said, no, we're going to fight the next day. And we're going to fight the next day. And we're going to fight the next day until we win this war. We're going to fight every single day. And you would think the soldiers would be upset. But instead, they cheered. They cried in joy because they realized that this was the guy that was going to win the war and they can go home and see their families. And so really, from the moment he takes over, the war in the East is really just one major battle. So from about May of 1864, for a full year, he never quits fighting. And he just clobbers Lee and his army to the point of submission. On the other side, because Grant has left the West for the East. So the West now is in charge of Grant's second in command, a guy named Sherman, William Sherman. And by the way, I know I'm talking to a bunch of Georgians. But William Sherman, also from Illinois, close friends with Grant. Also, of course, Lincoln's from Illinois. And I think that does help, the fact that they all kind of knew each other and could speak the same language. Sherman basically does the same thing Grant does. And he just starts clobbering the rest of the Confederacy. His big event was he captured Atlanta. Of course, Atlanta wasn't what people think it was. Atlanta was not the capital of Georgia at that point. It won't be capital until 1869. The capital, of course, was Milledgeville at this point. But Atlanta was important because it was the transportation hub. By the way, I'm going to show you a clip online of the big scene from Gone with the Wind when Atlanta burned. In the movie, Atlanta is shown as this major city. It was really just a small hub, but it's where all the railroads came through. That's what made Atlanta so important. And it's important also because Lincoln was running for re-election, and there was a chance he might have lost. Um, and so the winning of Atlanta sort of gave him that little boost, and it helped him win the election. Then Sherman just basically did the same thing Grant was doing in Virginia, just kept fighting and fighting and fighting. He doesn't win every battle, but he just keeps going and going and going. In the winter of 1864 and into 1865, he just starts marching across Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Again, this is Sherman. And again, he's not very well liked by a lot of people. I don't really understand why. I think partly because he doesn't look like a nice person. But then again, if I'm going to be in a fight, I want that guy on my. He looks like a mean SOB. This is a guy I want fighting on my side. Um, and I know in the South it's like, oh, he destroyed everything and they raped everybody and killed everybody, and that's not really true. It is absolutely true that they marched straight across Georgia. You can see from Atlanta to Savannah, that up through the Carolinas. First off, before I finish, if an army can do this, you have lost the war. This guy does this unopposed. No one's stopping him, basically. I mean, there are some small fighting, but generally he's able to just do this. But it is true that he did burn a lot of stuff. They cut down telegraph wires. They destroyed bridges. They destroyed railroads. Because again, remember what the goal is. Make the Confederate Army not able to fight. So don't let them communicate. Don't let them load up troops on a train and go from here to there. But what he did not do was burn down farms. They did not kill civilians or anything like that. That is a myth. Cotton fields were burned, but not by Sherman. Cotton fields were actually burned by local residents, so Sherman couldn't get the cotton, but Sherman didn't want the cotton. It's like, burn the cotton so he can't have it, but he didn't want it. But, so the damage was real, but it has been greatly exaggerated over the years. Finally, I mean, again, it's clear the war is over at this point. But wars can be over many times, long before people quit fighting. Sherman's marching through the West, which now the West is pretty much the Carolinas. At the same time, Lee is absolutely losing. He's in Petersburg, Virginia. He's surrounded by Grant. He manages, with he and his army, to escape briefly. Grant tracks him down. And finally, at Appomattox, Lee surrendered. So this is actually the building where the surrender happened. And again, if you want, this is, in case you're wondering, this is where in Virginia we're talking about. Lee wasn't supposed to surrender. The government of the Confederacy did not approve this. They wanted to keep fighting. And again, it's so typical that the people who aren't doing the fighting are the ones that keep saying, yeah, keep fighting. But the people actually on the field, the ones suffering, of course, they're the ones paying the price. And Lee, regardless of how you might feel about his politics, about slavery and stuff, but just purely as a military leader, to me, he deserves a lot of respect here. Because he could have kept fighting. This war could have gone on easily 2 more years, just guerrilla warfare, kind of like in Iraq today. Just keep going and but he realized this is ridiculous. Why are people dying needlessly? And so he surrendered. He went and he basically was a traitor to the Confederacy and said, we're gonna walk away. We're gonna let these people go home and see their families again. And so he surrenders to Grant, who offered very generous terms to let the soldiers keep some of their own guns. He ordered the U.S. Army to salute the Confederate Army. He had the band play Dixie in their honor, because the idea was that the war is over with now. These are fellow Americans now. Later, Lee and some others will be imprisoned briefly. Grant will actually be the one that will make sure that they're freed. And I think Jefferson Davis spent a full year in prison, and Grant's actually the one that got him out of prison. So anyway, the same thing will end up happening down in the Carolinas. The generals down there will also surrender to Sherman, same terms. And at this point, we're now starting as a country, like, how do we stop fighting? Which to me is the most important part of this is the, even though I just went an hour and a half talking about the war, but really it's the aftermath of the war that's so important. We're not going to get too deep into that. That's a US2 topic, but we do have a tiny bit more to talk about. One of them is the capture of the leaders of the Confederacy. So Alexander Stephens, a couple others did indeed go ahead and surrender. But some of the other leaders, like Judah P. Benjamin, who was Secretary of War for the Confederacy, he actually ran down to Florida and then managed to hop on a ship and find his way to England and end up living a very nice life in England. Jefferson Davis, the president, he and his wife and a couple of people started running. And at Irwinville, Georgia, he was captured by a guy named Colonel Wilson of the U.S. Army. The story has always been that he was dressed up like a woman, like you see here in this image. I love that image. It's funny, and it's not true. It's kind of true. He was with his wife and a couple of people. He heard the dogs coming early one morning. He grabbed his wife's coat, and he says, I'm going to run. And he put her coat on and ran away. So he was technically wearing women's clothing, but it's not like, I'm Sally. That's not true. To me, this is very typical. That's this whole thing. Think about this. Some of the poorest people, say in Georgia, were fighting and dying in this war. And the guy who helped lead this, this guy voted for secession, right? What does he do when the war is over with? Instead of standing up like an honorable person and facing the consequences, he runs away. I think it's very revealing of it. Unlike, say, Lee, who stood up and Lee assumed he was going to be killed. He assumed he would die because technically he committed treason. He assumed he was going to be shot and killed, and yet he stood up anyway. Anyway, you get the point. I think one of the last major events, so it does need to be mentioned, is the killing of the president that happened right after the war was over with. So the war is over with. There's still a little bit of fighting happening. Texas still has a little bit of fighting all the way until late June, but really the war is over with. And to kind of celebrate, there's going to be a play called Our American Cousin that's going to be offered at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And Lincoln has agreed. He and his wife are going to show up, and they're going to enjoy this post-war event. And of course, it was really exciting because one of the biggest actors of the day was a guy named John Wilkes Booth, who was a big Shakespearean actor, and people loved him. He was from Maryland. But he didn't fight in the war. He's a young man, but he chose to just act instead. And so Lincoln was really excited to see John Wilkes Booth in this play. And it was a big hit play already, and And of course, this is Ford's Theater. This is what it looks like today. And if you ever get to DC, I do recommend. And in fact, they do still do productions there. This is what the inside looks like. You can see the balcony right there, almost on the stage. This is where Lincoln would have sat. This was, the official place. This is what it would have looked like at the time. So again, a little more. DC was kind of just a muddy small town at that point. But of course, as many of you know, John Wilkes Booth ended up assassinating Lincoln. It's just amazing to me, as somebody who's done theater, that he was in the play and the whole time going, okay, during the intermission, I'm going to go up and kill the president. And so he snuck into the box and had his gun and then managed to shoot Lincoln again in the back of the head. And then jumped off the balcony onto the stage. It was actually a bit higher than it looks like here. He broke his leg, in fact, when he landed on the stage. But he's still, being an actor, being, somebody who wants the limelight. He, in Latin, screamed, "Death to tyrants," and limped off, jumped on a horse, and boom, ran off. Eventually was captured and killed. So what's going on here? Well, John Wilkes Booth, again, was from Maryland, a slave state, and he believed in slavery. He believed in the Confederacy. During the war, now again, he didn't fight, but he did spy for the South. He sent supplies to the South. And when he found out the war was over with, he was furious, and decided to keep the war going. So his plan was to kill the president and ideally bring chaos so the war could keep going. Leave it to the people not doing the fighting, again, who want to keep the war going. But as some of you may know, this was a much bigger conspiracy. It was actually several people involved in this. It wasn't John Wilkes Booth was in charge, but there actually was a lot of people involved. And the plan wasn't just to kill Lincoln. The plan was also to kill several other people. So the vice president, who's the guy at the bottom, somebody was supposed to go to his house and kill him. Ulysses S. Grant, who's also on the bottom on the right, he was supposed to go to the play with Lincoln. He was supposed to also be killed by Booth. He ended up not going that night because his wife was ill, so he survived. The person that was supposed to kill the vice president just chickened out, didn't do it. So the vice president survived. And then the other person that was supposed to be killed was the Secretary of State, a guy named Seward. Now, he had been injured in a wagon accident, so he was at home in bed. And when the assassin showed up here, Seward's son answered. The assassin beat the son up, ran up the stairs, pulled out a knife, and started stabbing Secretary Seward in the face and the stomach and the chest, but he didn't hit one major organ. So when he ran away, he thought he had killed them, but actually, even though he's disfigured, you can see the picture on the right is what he looked like before, and the picture on the left is his face after it been disfigured. He ended up surviving. In fact, he will end up serving for several more years. In fact, the reason we have Hawaii is because Seward bought Hawaii from Russia. I'm just kidding, not Hawaii. My goodness, I just screwed that up. He bought Alaska from Russia in 1868. Anyway, so the plan was to kill several people in the government and keep the war going. Of course, Lincoln was the only one shot. He died. He was taken to a house across the street and died early the next morning. What's interesting is that the plan was, again, to bring the South back. But what ended up happening is that it really brought the Union together. In a weird way, Lincoln was almost a martyr. Because even in the South, they said, we surrendered. He should not have done that. And so the mourning over Lincoln, even a lot of Southerners hated Lincoln. And his election is what started this war in many ways. But at the same time, his death really did begin to bring the United States back together. So finally, by summer of 1865, the country is trying to rebuild in lots of different ways. Of course, the 13th Amendment had been passed by this point, so slaves are being freed. But the nation was together, but it was in tatters in many ways, especially in the South. It was, again, our bloodiest war. You can start seeing the numbers of people killed and wounded. The South, many parts of it, completely destroyed. Now, Bainbridge, Tifton, places like that, not as much as touched physically. But you get places like Charleston and Petersburg and Savannah and Atlanta, Vicksburg, it looks like World War II, basically. And of course, the United States also suffered a lot of deaths. And economically, everybody was hurting. This was a major event. And it's going to take a long time to get over this. And again, the United States at this point, we're back together, but we're not going to forget these wounds. We're not going to forget the anger. This is an image of former slaves digging up the bodies of Union soldiers that were left behind in Cold Harbor, Virginia. And again, this is a war that was fought amongst us. So there's dead bodies everywhere. The land is blood-soaked. And I don't mean just physically, but also emotionally as well. And so, these guys are going to have to go home and try to rebuild their lives and deal with that and try to rebuild the economy. And of course, you have millions of African Americans, not only the soldiers who fought for the United States Army, but now the millions of slaves who are freed. What's going to happen to them? Are they citizens? If they're citizens, do they get to vote? Because women don't vote, and they're citizens, do they get to vote? What kind of rights do they have? Are they going to be brought into the Union? Or are they going to have to live somewhere like Native Americans? They're going to have to leave the country. Of course, we know the answer in the long run, but back then they didn't know those answers. And those are things that are going to have to be settled. And of course, once you get past the war, now you get into a period called Reconstruction. But luckily for us, that's a US 2 topic. So anyway, thank you guys. Thank you for the term. Thank you for listening to this lecture. And good luck on your final exam. Thank you, everybody. And good luck. And hope to see you in another class. Goodbye.